Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
Hello, this is John Bicknell. Before we get started on this week's discussion on insider threats, I'd like to remind our audience that on Wednesday, December the 14th, from 12 until 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we're having an IPA members-only live podcast recording and social. The topic of the discussion will be the United States Information Agency, or USIA, and two previous Cognitive Crucible podcast guests will be discussing a recent article that they wrote, which unpack some of the myths and perceptions around USIA, Mr. Matt Armstrong and Dr. Chris Paul. But in order to join this discussion, you need to be an IPA member. You can also think about joining IPA as a donation, which goes directly to supporting our mission. And there are several different membership tiers that you can choose from, which fit into your budget. And we thank you for supporting the Information Professionals Association. And now on to today's discussion. My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. John Roginski, who is the program manager for the West Point Insider Threat Program, which serves as the research arm for the Pentagon-administered Army Insider Threat Program. John Roginski, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
John, thanks a lot for the invitation, and thanks for your time this afternoon. I really appreciate the opportunity.
The conversation I'd like to have with you today, John, unsurprisingly, will cover insider threats. But before we get into this topic, could we start by getting your assessment of our strategic landscape?
Sure thing, John. So in my opinion, and I guess this is a good place to say that everything I say in this podcast is going to be exactly that. It's my opinion. I'm not speaking on behalf of the United States Military Academy, the Army, or Department of Defense. And that's something that I think is important to be said. But that being said, it's not news that today's strategic landscape is both more complicated and really more complex than it's ever been before. But one of the reasons for that I don't hear discussed very often. In my opinion, we seem to have a bit of a crisis of identity on the world stage that may be exacerbating the strategic and operational challenges we face. What I mean is, are we a global leader? Are we an ally? Are we a team player? Are we a first among equals? Each of those characterizations has a bit of a different implication on how we view our strategic landscape. But one thing is for certain, I believe that the asymmetric knowledge and technological advantage that we've enjoyed since the end of the Cold War is either likely no longer there, or the gap is closing on a trajectory to no longer be there in the coming years. This fundamental change in military, and that means diplomatic affairs, is one that we've got to face head on. But first, we've got to know who we are and where we stand in our environment. Common to most of those directions we should go is something that I'm very passionate about, and that is the importance of humans within the system. A lot of things that we see in organizations or in the news, we talk about the importance of machines and cyber and computers. We seem to leave the import of humans out of it. So as powerful as new and existing technologies are, people are our center of gravity. So we've got to teach, coach, train, mentor, and care for our people so that the workforce can protect our way of life.
Yeah, good observation there for sure. Perhaps we can start off with getting a short little 101 or an introduction to insider threats. What does this mean? is there a history to insider threats, and what's unique, or why do insider threats matter today?
Yes, thank you for that question. So the idea of insider threat means something different to just about everybody. If we go back a little bit in time, in 2011, President Obama issued an executive order, 13587. It established something called the National Insider Threat Task Force. So we wonder what the government says insider threats are. It's like, well, the NITF states that an insider threat is a threat posed to US national security by someone who misuses or betrays, wittingly or unwittingly, their authorized access to any government resource. The threat can include damage through espionage, terrorism, unauthorized disclosure of national security information, or through the loss or degradation of departmental resources or capabilities. So that's really what the space of insider threat has traditionally been since the instantiation of these national assets. When people think about insider threat in my experience, they do lean very heavily cyber, and it's often information, kind of non-kinetic ideas. But we also have some very clear and poignant examples of kinetic insider threats. For example, in 2009, Major Nidal Hasan killed 13 and injured 32 at Fort Hood in one of the most high-profile kinetic insider threat attacks in our history. That particular insider threat attack caused a big review and a significant change to the priority of counter insider threat programs in the DoD and in the Army. And so we've got this balance between the ideas of kinetic insider threats, workplace violence, and these non-kinetic information-oriented insider threat attacks. Addressing these kinds of attacks has really been important since there were military organizations and even businesses. So it's been there for thousands of years, but it's even more important now than ever. I talked earlier about the complexity of our operating environment, the dynamic nature of our strategic landscape, and even the potential shifting of power balances. So if we've got all of those things working at once, we really have got to be able to trust the people to our right and left. And that means forming an organizational atmosphere and culture that identifies potential insider risks, reduces insider threat activity, and mitigates the effect of that activity if it does happen. It becomes more important now because everything else is so difficult. We've got to be able to trust inside the organization.
Is it helpful at all to think of insider threats as a spectrum? So you gave a couple of examples there, or you talked about the cyber. Frequently people think about it in cyber terms, but then there's also kinetic possibilities, and I can distinguish those kinds of activities as there's like point targets, and then there's area targets. Is that a useful lens to look at the landscape at all?
So I've never heard it couched in those terms before, and I very much like it, because when you look at an area kind of target in this particular discipline, you're talking about elements that really share similar leading indicators. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And
sure.
What I really like to do in this space is to take a step back from the traditional ways of looking at insider threat and focusing on espionage, terrorism, unauthorized disclosure. Thankfully, we've gotten to the point where we're talking about intentional and non-intentional. But let's take it a step further. The common problem with all of those events is that we have reduced the operational efficiency and efficacy of the organization and the unit. So why don't we take it a step further and look at other elements that reduce our operational effectiveness? And that means things like workplace violence, things like bullying, harassment, extremism, all of those things are elements that work inside of an organization to erode the atmosphere and erode the culture to reduce the power of the organization. So I think that is a great example, or maybe not a great example if I don't want to pat my own back, but that is an example of this area kind of target paradigm that you're talking about. And the point targets are the actual individuals where we identify somebody that may be at greater likelihood for insider activity. And so how do we deal with that on an individual basis? How do we inform the leader's ability to interact with the situation so that we protect not only the people, each individual person, but the enterprise itself? I very much like that. Thank you, John.
Yeah, cool.
Steal it.
It's yours. It belongs to the universe now. So you're an operations researcher, and some people hear this referred to as OR, or even like as an ORSA. Could you take just a brief moment and explain what operations research is to the audience? Some folks might not be familiar with what OR is.
Yes, I sure can. So there is an organization called INFORMS, which is the Institute for Operations Research and the Management Sciences. So INFORMS is really the operations research industry standard kind of organization and group. And if I'm able to borrow from them, they term operations research as being the science of better. And so what that means is look at really any situation that you have. Operations research can figure out a way to make it better, quicker, faster, more effective, more efficient. And why is that? Well, one of the reasons is because operations research is an inherently interdisciplinary field. Interdisciplinarity is super important these days because we've got complex problems. And as Einstein is attributed with saying, you can't solve the problems of today with the thinking used to create them. Well, that means that we've got to break down the silos between these disciplines. OR does that. And why? Well, an operations research practitioner has got several different tools in their toolbox. When an OR practitioner looks at a problem, they may use an optimization approach, which means, well, we're going to maximize or minimize some kind of quantity subject to a whole bunch of constraints. Perhaps they're going to take a mathematical modeling approach. Perhaps they're going to take a statistical approach or a probabilistic approach. Maybe simulation and an experimental design is a right tool for the problem. The operations research practitioner can use any one of those disciplines to solve a problem. So although each one of them is a discipline in and of itself, the OR practitioner cuts across all of them. And so that's important. I know that nowadays, so data science has become kind of a buzz term, if you will, of today. An OR practitioner has the chops to be able to work in the data science world as well, because we have experience with data, with ingestion, cleaning, working with, analyzing these kind of data, whether or not they are big data or small data or whatever it is. It is a tool that an OR practitioner has. Now, the OR guy may not have all of the tools that the guy with the, or the gal with the data science pedigree has, but we can get a large portion of the way there.
Right. Yeah. Real cool. Well, so could you just extend this little conversation about what operations research is into this discussion space? So how does an operations researcher see this insider threat challenge, and what are the kinds of things that you can do to address the challenge?
So I think the first point of intersection is the interdisciplinarity of
Hmm. Hmm.
both fields. The counter insider threat paradigm of research and analysis really cuts across all of the different domains, from hard science to soft, quantitative to qualitative, uh, pragmatic versus academic, all of these things. And so to solve a problem that is in and of itself interdisciplinary, using a field, an interdisciplinary field, or several of them, is a good first step. The interdisciplinarity the needs of the counter insider threat program is one of the reasons why the Department of Defense and headquarters Department of the Army decided to put the Army's research arm here at West Point. Because at West Point, so we've got almost 50 academic departments and research centers that span all of the different kinds of domains that you see in operations and academia. And so being able to put all of those together is one of the reasons why we're here. And it's one of the reasons why an OR practitioner like myself is involved in the program. But I think that there's a potentially even more important area that connects OR to this field, and that is an operations research practitioner has to develop skills of developing a relationship with leaders and decision makers. Because if you don't have a good relationship with the people, with the stakeholders for the research, well, then you don't inspire trust in the analysis. And that trust becomes super important. What an OR practitioner learns to do is it learns to generate the trust in that commander, in that leader, in that decision maker, so that they believe in and actually seek out the scientific and analytical approaches against the problem of the day, which in this case for me is countering the insider threat.
Wow, that's awesome. So could we dive in just a little further? And my understanding is that you and your colleagues are taking a novel approach to the insider threat problem. Could you unpack this a little bit for us, please?
Sure. To circle back around from that definition that I gave you from the NITIF, we're talking about espionage, terrorism, unauthorized disclosure, things of that nature, loss and degradation of resources and capabilities. And as I mentioned, often we think cyber first, but insider threat, it's really more than a cyber problem. Insider threat is an inherently human problem. So since that's the case, it must be considered in all of the complication and complexity associated with the human condition. Unfortunately, our current view seems to lack that nuanced view of the human perspective. We want to look at risk factors and accidental or malicious activity to be kind of homogeneous in the sense that their origins are familiar and the actions may look similar. And so because those origins are similar and the actions are similar, we want to bring together a common suite of tools that are usually analytical as some kind of prophylaxis or a response. But the analysis of these case studies help us to gain insight into some root causes of the behavior that indicates a connection between counter insider threat and the medical community. And so we want to use that connection with the medical community because we're looking at something that threat activity is like an organism that lives, breathes, and grows. So what we're doing throughout that connection with medical research is acknowledging that people in the medical community, what they look at is that predisposition for physical and mental disease or illness due to some kind of genetic or even behavioral factors or a combination. So For example, if we look at a disease, a diabetic just appears to be diabetic. They've got some pancreatic deficiency and the glucose isn't turned into energy. But the treatments for a type 2 diabetic is not the same as a type 1 diabetic. So even though that manifestation of the condition looks the same, how we get after that is different. And so a holistic approach to countering insider threat can account for similar considerations, bringing in the context, identifying the determinants of behaviors leading to and following from the activity that harms the organization. So what we're doing here in our program is we're looking at trait-based and state-based determinants of potential insider threat activity. And so what does that really mean? Well, when we look at the trait-based insider threat or insider risk activity, we're looking at somebody whose internal core values are misaligned with the organization's vision. And so that fundamental misalignment means that we've got higher risk likelihood, higher threat likelihood, and potentially a terminally disgruntled person. Now, the state-based insider risk or insider threat idea is one in which you've got an employee who throughout their entire career or time with the organization has been a fine employee, has been working hard, doing all the things that they need to do. But they've encountered some kind of stimulus, some kind of catalyst, some kind of issue that has happened inside of their life. And that issue or catalyst causes them to be at higher likelihood for insider activity. And so when both of these, whether or not it's a trait-related or a state-related threat, they may manifest in some kind of insider activity. The way that we can mitigate those are completely different. For example, with a trait-based insider, well, that's a human resources issue. We've got to work hard to make sure that we bring on people that are aligned with the organization. And if we get it wrong, we have to be okay with the fact that it's acceptable to ask an employee to be excellent somewhere else. And that's something that we typically don't like to do. We believe that we can teach, coach, mentor, and guide somebody towards the holy grail of being the perfect employee. Well, sometimes that's not possible, and we have to identify that. Now, with the state-based insider, we've got to, this is a place that we can use analytics to detect some kind of a change in behavioral pattern or activity or something of this nature that highlights the fact that this employee is under trauma or stress. How can we align them with resource that makes them whole again? And I think that those are the two ideas that we're really working on right now.
Wow, so many potential follow-up questions, yet so little time. So how do you guys actually go about doing this? Are there different analysis techniques or different data sets that are used, whether or not you're trying to get after trait-based insider threats or state-based, or is it one big model that has all of these variables combined and you weight them? Could you talk just a little bit about what data you use and how you actually go about identifying possible insider threats?
Yes, and so I think it'd be best to talk about it in generality.
Sure.
And so from the trait-based side, what we're really looking at is refining our values-based hiring processes. And so there are ways that we can consider potential employees or even employees that we have on hand from a values-based perspective that helps to make sure that we are bringing in people that are aligned with where the organization wants to go. Now, that often is not simply an analytical process. It is a human in the loop process. And that makes it a bit of a challenge, right? Because when you're talking about an organization that is large, how do you put the human in the loop with hiring in a large organization? It's relatively easy if you've got a small organization and you can conduct in-depth interviews and do things of that nature. But combining those ideas with the fact that, for the Department of Defense or Department of the Army, it's a big organization. We bring on a lot of people all the time. And so looking at that is one of the challenges that we have. Now, fortunately for us, we see it as a possible idea, because really the Army, even as big as it is really a team of teams. And so the span of control of a military leader is relatively small, for 3, 4, 5, 6 people each. And so we have small unit potential even in an organization that's as large as the Army. Now, from the state-based side, we are really awash in data here, in really the not only the Army and the Department of Defense, but really across the entire world in which we live. And so there are techniques that we can use to potentially use the data that we have already to help us to ensure that our workforce is whole, well, and resilient. And those are some of the ideas that we're trying to pursue at the moment.
So this has all been fascinating, John. And so, as we mentioned at the top, you lead West Point's Insider Threat Program. And so surely you guys are probably collaborating with other organizations outside of West Point and maybe even outside of the military. So who are some of the organizations that you guys are collaborating with? And if you could cast forward even further, what other kinds of organizations would you like to collaborate with that you're maybe don't have such a strong relationship with currently?
Wow, that's a great question, John. And I wish I had my Santa Claus list.
Okay. Tis the season.
Indeed. And so at the moment with our research program, so we've got a few partners that are longstanding for us. Obviously, the folks in the Pentagon, the Headquarters Department of the Army, G357 Protection Directorate, the Undersecretary of Defense for Intel and Security. We take a lot of direction from them and do a lot of work with them, especially through our summer internship program. So over the last couple of years, we've sent 24 cadets, all across the United States to do some real research work in the area. Another important partner for us is kind of a heavy hitter in the insider threat world. It's Persirex Threat Lab out in Monterey, California. And so we've done some work with them and really consider them to be a very, very important partner. But we also, outside of the Army in particular, we also have partners in Department of the Air Force and Department of the Navy to try to bring a different perspective to the problem. But in addition to the DoD partners, as you had mentioned, we also are we take a lot of our kind of research ideas and guidelines from the work that's being done at ARLIS, at the University of Maryland, at the Carnegie Mellon's Institute for Insider Threat Research that they run. They've done a lot of really, really solid work, but also corporate partners that we're doing work with currently. The Logistics Management Institute, LMI, down in the National Capital Region, and also D3 Systems that does a lot of statistics and modeling work with us. Those are two important kind of corporate partners, but we would like to expand the aperture, not only in the kind of the US corporate world, right? Because insider threat is not just a Department of Defense problem. It's, as I had mentioned earlier, it's a business problem, right? There is information leakage, there is worker issues, there are people that work against organizations that are corporate in nature, and that viewpoint is extremely important. James Surowiecki wrote a book called The Wisdom of Crowds, in which he talks about the fact that if you've got a group of people with diverse perspectives, you're going to get a far better output than if you've got one caped superhero. And we see that it replays itself over and over and over again. And one of the most important factors in a wise crowd is a diversity of viewpoints. And so any partnerships that we can cultivate that increase our diversity of thought just make a better product. And so that's really where we would like to extend. We are also currently in the midst of trying to work towards gaining some partners in NATO to expand the thought processes that we have beyond even the United States and include the viewpoints from our partner nations.
Excellent, excellent. Maybe we could do a quick lightning round here, John, and then close on out. So you mentioned this before, but could you give just another quick beat on talent?
Yeah, so talent is hard to come by, right? I mean, the same people that we are interested in working with in the counter insider threat area are in demand everywhere else. And so the idea of us to be able to show the utility in service of this area to the high performers and the people that truly get it is very, very important.
China.
That's a tough one, right? Because if you're one in a million, there's 2 million of you, and so there is they are a significant near peer competitor for us in a lot of different ways, and we need to understand not only our own strategic aims but theirs as well, so that we can be in good competition. But looking at the long view, because they certainly do.
And finally, lightning round, OODA loop.
The OODA loop has a lot of significant contributions here, because we have to look at the last two parts of that. We've got to decide and we've got to act, right? We've got to be able to do a thing, because if we don't have tangible outputs, then we're not doing any good. We can't just sit around admiring the problem, so yeah, we have to do all of those things, observe, orient, but we've got to, at the end of the day, we've got to act.
Right. Is there a direct touch point as well with your insider threat detection work, in that being able to identify quickly insider threats and as you just said, act upon that, those insights or those predictions, I guess?
Yes, that becomes incredibly important, because in many cases, time is of the essence. We don't have the time to waste, but trying to wade through all of the factors that we have to wade through is it is a significant challenge, and that's why we need to use the tools of the day, contemporary techniques, to be able to wade through all this information.
Yeah, yeah. It really dawns on me that better, faster decision making and it the OODA loop construct. I think a lot of people can criticize it for its simplicity, but simplicity has value sometimes, and better, faster decision making. I think is very much needed these days.
Is it
Um,
simple or is it elegant?
yeah,
That's
yeah, absolutely. Um, we have a lot of students and researchers who listen to this podcast. John, could you offer a fruitful research question that's related to the kinds of things that we've been discussing?
sure. Something that I've been thinking about is I'd like to pose the question: how do we lead the development and or maintenance of organizational culture so that the workforce is connected to and invested in the organization and believes that connection and investiture is reciprocated?
Excellent. All right. Well, I hope that there are some students listening who are eager to take a crack at that. Finally, what's a good book or other online resource related to the kinds of things that we've been talking about?
So, because we've been talking a lot about organizational culture and atmosphere, I will offer the one book that I consider to be the must read for any leader. And that is the book is called Legacy by James Kerr. This book is about the New Zealand All Blacks rugby team. And it is a book that is written from the perspective of here are 15 lessons that the business world can learn from the All Blacks. And it is all about creating a high performing culture. And I would posit to you that if we have cultures that follow these tenets, we don't have a problem with insider threat.
All right, some fantastic suggestions and thought-provoking discussion. And with that, Dr. John Roginski, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you very much for having me, John. I really appreciate it.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.